Imagine you're a contracts officer at Naval Sea Systems Command. It's October 2023, and the document in front of you describes a routine logistics problem. The destroyer USS Benfold needs maintenance work that American yards don't have the bandwidth to handle on schedule. The solution your team has drafted is straightforward. Route the work to Allied yards in Japan or Australia. The legal frameworks exist. Partners in both countries have done this kind of work before. The paperwork is already prepared. You initial the routing sheet and move to the next item in the stack. Nobody in that room thought this was a big deal. That's the problem. The United States Navy was quietly routing warship maintenance to foreign countries, not under enemy fire, not in a crisis, simply because American shipbuilding no longer had the capacity to keep pace with its own fleet's maintenance schedule. The country that once launched a new warship every 3 days during a world war, while simultaneously manufacturing tanks, aircraft, and the bomb that ended it, could not keep up with basic repair throughput. And the remarkable thing is how unremarkable it felt in the room. So how does the nation that outbuilt the entire planet in 1944 become the nation that cannot maintain its own fleet 80 years later? The answer is a 70-year process, almost entirely predictable, almost entirely ignored, and still running. In 1943, American shipyards launched a new Liberty cargo ship every 42 hours, not each week, every 42 hours around the clock. A new vessel entered the water somewhere along the American coast or Gulf. 18 major yards were operating simultaneously at peak, over 400,000 workers. The logistics operation was so vast, it redefined what industrial meant for a generation of economists and policymakers. The United States won World War II with soldiers. It sustained that war with ships. Today, America builds roughly 1% of global commercial shipping tonnage. China builds close to half. That shift, from dominant to functionally irrelevant in commercial construction, didn't happen overnight. It happened through a series of decisions that each made perfect sense in isolation, and which collectively constructed a trap that now takes a generation to exit. But here's the problem. To understand how an industrial nation loses a foundational capability, you have to start not with the collapse, but with the policy that was designed to prevent one. In 1920, Congress passed the Merchant Marine Act. Section 27 became known as the Jones Act, and its logic was strategic. Any goods transported between American ports had to travel on ships that were American-built, American-owned, American-flagged, and American-crewed. The purpose was to guarantee a domestic maritime industrial base, a reserve of vessels and skilled sailors that the military could draw on in an emergency. Protect the industry. Keep the capability alive. The logic was sound. What protection actually produced was a captive market. American carriers shipping between domestic ports had no foreign competition to worry about. American shipyards building for those carriers had no global benchmark to meet. The incentive to modernize, to automate, to compete on cost and speed, that incentive simply wasn't there. The buyers had no alternatives, the sellers had no pressure. By the 1970s, building a comparable commercial vessel in the United States cost roughly 3 times the price of an equivalent ship built in Japan. I spent time going through the Senate Commerce Committee hearings from that period, and one detail kept nagging me. Lawmakers knew the cost gap was widening. Multiple witnesses testified with detailed projections showing exactly where the trajectories led. The analysis was clear and the warnings were specific. And then, with a few narrow exceptions, nothing fundamentally changed. Because the political coalition behind the Jones Act, maritime unions, domestic operators, coastal shipping companies, was durable and organized. The costs of the policy spread across everyone who shipped goods between American ports. Consumers paid slightly more for freight to Hawaii or Puerto Rico, and they rarely traced the cost back to its source. The people paying the Jones Act tax didn't know they were paying it. The industry it was protecting stayed alive, but alive inside a domestic bubble, while the global commercial market moved to Japan, then South Korea, then to Chinese mega yards being built at a scale American yards had never attempted. The orders that would have required American yards to scale, automate, and develop the efficiency to compete Those orders never came. Without volume, there is no flywheel. And without the flywheel, you cannot keep the skills alive. This was the first mechanism, not a collapse, a slow, quiet withdrawal from capability, hidden behind protection that felt like stability. But underneath it, something was dissolving that would take decades to notice and longer to reverse. Shipbuilding is what economists call a complex industry. Its capabilities don't live in machines or patents. They live in people, and in the relationships between people, suppliers, and institutions that form over decades of continuous practice. A master welder who understands the metallurgy of pressure hull construction. A pipe fitter who has installed marine propulsion systems across 3 different vessel classes. A naval architect who can look at a design change and immediately know which downstream suppliers it affects and why. These skills take 15 to 20 years to fully develop. They require continuous active projects to maintain, and they are functionally invisible until they're gone. What's most surprising about this isn't the scale of the loss. It's how quickly the decay accelerates once it starts. When a yard closes, the workers scatter. Some retire, some retrain for adjacent industries. A few find work at surviving yards. But the institutional knowledge, the tacit understanding of how a particular class of hull behaves under load, which supplier has the right alloy, what the design drawing doesn't say but any experienced builder knows, that knowledge doesn't get documented. It doesn't transfer to a successor organization. It dissolves with the people who carried it. The flywheel metaphor is too gentle. A flywheel slows gradually. Industrial skill erosion operates more like a ratchet. Each yard closure, each retiring master craftsman, each contract that goes to a foreign competitor turns the mechanism one notch in a direction it cannot reverse on its own. The Navy understood this clearly by the early 2010s. A major industrial base assessment published in 2012 was unusually direct by government standards, naming specific capability gaps, specific supplier tiers at risk of closure, specific windows before certain competencies would become unrecoverable without importing them from abroad. The response was a targeted reinvestment program, new contract vehicles, workforce development funding, facility modernization at several yards. The obstacle was structural. You cannot train a maritime workforce in a vacuum. Training programs needed journeymen to teach apprentices. The journeymen were retiring faster than apprentices could be fully certified. The contract pipeline wasn't deep enough to sustain both the training throughput and the production targets simultaneously. The program produced measurable results, not enough to close the gap with what China had already built. Because while America was trying to hold a floor, China was building a ceiling. In 2000, China produced roughly 5% of global commercial shipping tonnage. By 2024, that share exceeded 50%. The trajectory was not accidental. China designated shipbuilding as a strategic national industry in the 1990s. State banks provided financing at rates no commercial lender would match. Yards received direct capital subsidies. Land was allocated ahead of demand. Vocational training pipelines were built specifically to feed yard employment. Government policy guaranteed order volume at the critical early stages before private market demand could have sustained the industry on its own. The result is a collection of facilities that operate at a scale and efficiency with no Western equivalent. The largest Chinese shipbuilding complex occupies more area than the entire borough of Manhattan. If you find this analysis useful, hit like. The algorithm needs the signal to show this to people who should see it. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface, until you see the strategic logic underneath. China isn't simply building commercial ships. Commercial and military shipbuilding share the same industrial base. The welders, the steel fabricators, the hull designers, the propulsion engineers, they work across both sectors. A nation with 50% of global commercial shipbuilding capacity has 50% of global shipbuilding capacity. Full stop. And that is what gives the current situation its particular weight. The United States operates the most powerful naval fleet in the world. It operates that fleet with a domestic industrial base that cannot build commercial vessels at globally competitive prices, cannot repair its warships at full required throughput. and cannot rapidly expand production if demand sharply increases. That isn't a rhetorical vulnerability, it's a measured one. The question is, what changes it? Here's the take that will probably get pushback. The Jones Act deserves more blame for this situation than it typically receives, and the constituencies that defended it most aggressively are not the same ones that paid the price. The workers in American shipyards didn't create the captive market dynamic, they were employed within it. When the yards contracted, workers bore the cost, lost jobs, disrupted pension structures, communities in Gulf Coast and Pacific Northwest port cities that never fully recovered. The maritime unions that fought to preserve the Jones Act were defending their members' short-term employment. That's a coherent interest. But the structural effect of sustained protection without mandated modernization was to preserve an industry's form rather than its capability. And when the form could no longer be maintained, the capability had already eroded. That's not a coincidence. That's the predictable outcome of protecting incumbents instead of investing in competitiveness. Is repealing or substantially reforming the Jones Act now the right answer? Or has skill erosion gone far enough that opening competition would simply expose a hollowed-out domestic base to rivals it cannot currently meet? Drop your answer in the comments. The people who study this professionally are not in agreement, and the question is live. What the American shipbuilding case reveals isn't specific to ships, it's the logic of industrial clusters, the same mechanism that explains why no country has successfully replicated Silicon Valley through policy alone, why the Swiss watchmaking industry survived the quartz crisis while the American industry collapsed, why certain categories of manufacturing capability, once lost, require not capital investment but time. Industrial clusters are concentrations of tacit knowledge, not equipment, not patents, knowledge that lives in people, in supplier relationships, in professional networks, in the accumulated understanding that forms over decades of working on hard problems in proximity. Here's what this tells us about the broader situation in 2026. The United States is having this exact conversation, with varying degrees of urgency and honesty, about semiconductor fabrication, pharmaceutical active ingredient manufacturing, rare earth processing, and several categories of defense components. Shipbuilding is simply the case where the ratchet has already turned furthest. It is the clearest model of how the mechanism works, how long it takes, and what the exit costs. Once a cluster falls below critical density, it doesn't decline gradually, it collapses. The last supplier who can source marine-grade steel plate to specification closes. The last yard with active hull design experience loses its team to retirement. The last training program that can certify marine welders loses its accreditation. After each of those events, you are no longer reforming an industry. You are rebuilding one from the outside at the speed of a generation, at the cost of a dependency you did not choose. If you want to understand which other strategic industries are currently approaching that threshold, and what the underlying mechanism looks like before it tips, subscribe to Mapped. That's the question this channel is built around. Go back to that contracts officer in October 2023. The decision to route destroyer maintenance to Allied yards was the correct one, given the available options, given what American yards could handle, given the Navy's operational timeline, given the political reality that rebuilding domestic capacity takes budget cycles and political will that had not been assembled. The Allied yard solution was sensible, practical, and right. But sensible immediate solutions and structural solutions are not the same thing. Every ship that leaves for a Japanese or Australian dry dock is a ship not sustaining an American yard's order book. Every order that doesn't arrive is a journeyman welder who takes a different job. Every journeyman who leaves is a decade of skill that doesn't transfer to an apprentice. Will the United States build meaningful commercial and naval shipbuilding capacity within the next generation? Comment yes or no, because the answer depends almost entirely on policy decisions being made in budget cycles that most people are not watching. The contracts officer finishes the routing sheet. Another ship leaves. The ratchet turns one more notch.